Hi, everyone. Look, we're back.
Yeah.
It's been a moment since Ashmi and I have hosted one of these lives, so we're really excited to be here with you all today. So I know it takes a few minutes for folks to just transition out of their other meetings. So if you're here with us already, go ahead, grab a beverage, grab a notepad, whatever you feel would be helpful for you today as you join our conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time to do so. And for the folks who are joining us, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. So feel free to add your name and your location to the comments. And generally for today on lives, it's that's the best way for us to hear from you, to hear what is standing out for you, and also any questions that are coming up for you as well during this time. So yeah, definitely go ahead and drop those into the comments and we'll see them along the way as well. And as you're sharing your name and as you're sharing your location, we'd also love to hear like what got you interested in this topic. For us, when we put this on, this is something that's been showing up in our space. So we wanted to create space to have a conversation around it because we didn't know of that many folks that were talking about this. But what brought you here today and what are you curious about? Yeah. And Ashmi, over to you if you can just help guide us in terms of today's structure.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Betty. Yeah, so as we have our conversation today, just a couple agreements that we can all keep in mind is the first one is just to stay curious. Betty and I will do the same, but there's no right or wrong perspective. We're essentially just sharing our personal lived experience as well as what we've learned from our clients. And there's not just one way to see things. If you have a different take, we'd love to hear it in the comments, as Betty said. Love a good challenge. And also to just stay open. So, this is part of a larger journey. We're not here to give advice or tell anyone what to do. We just want to share experiences and also just normalize talking about these things and the way they show up for folks. And yeah, while I have the mic, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself as well. I'm Ashmi Patel. I'm a life coach for late diagnosed, undiagnosed ADHD women. And my goal is to just help ADHD women shed the shame and get their sparkle back. So, a lot of us have been masking and have essentially just been muted our whole lives. And I want to help you let go of that and just design a life that feels good for you and doesn't make you feel like you have to fit into anyone else's box. I'd say I'm all about soft accountability and slow journeys. So I think that life is hard enough. I'm not in the business of making it any harder. Just, I really do believe that we can all be nicer to ourselves and to other people. And I think self compassion and giving yourself grace is a great way to start that journey and will eventually make the world a kinder place to live in. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. And if you, I'll continue to share throughout our chat. But if you have any questions or if you want to get in touch, I love getting DMs. I love meeting new people. So I would love to meet any one of you that's listening today. Off to you, Betty.
Yes. Double down on what Ashmi said. We love new friends. So by all means, like we don't bite, we promise. So feel free to message us afterwards, especially if there's something that we're sharing today that you're like, oh, this really got me thinking and I really want to explore this more. But just a little bit about myself also before we get started. My name is Betty Chan, and I am an authenticity life coach. And I primarily work with folks who I call code switchers. Pretty much someone who feels like they have to like be two people or pretty much everyone to be everyone for everyone else, but to be themselves is hard and challenging. And the work I really love doing with them is just helping them come to a place where they feel safe enough to take off that protective armor they've had to wear their whole lives to keep the true version of themselves from the world outside of them because we all have our own reasons of why we do that, but part of the process of being able to show up authentically is to really confidently say yes to who we are without needing others to say that first. So oftentimes what I do in my coaching is we have a mix of healing as well as like just setting goals for ourselves in terms of where does authenticity start to make our life a lot more full and richer? And this could be how you show up as a parent, how you show up as a partner, how you show up as a leader, or just as an expert in your field as well. I know last year authenticity was like the word of the year or something, but the funny thing about it is to be ourselves is actually kind of challenging in today's society. So that's how I usually work with folks and help them get back to themselves. Yeah. So let's get cracking. Let's get into this topic today. I'm not going to lie. The funny thing about this topic and the timing of our topics is that it is usually something that's present in our personal space and what we see coming up again and again with our clients as well. To be very meta about it, I was having resistance about having a conversation about resistance. So for those of you who can follow, kudos to you on that one. But it was just starting to trip us up of like, okay, we have these goals, we have these dreams, we got clear on what we want to do as opposed to what we should do, but there was just still some resistance showing up for us and the folks we work with. So we wanted just to create an open conversation in space and just talk about what is this resistance about? Like, how do we start recognizing it? What does it start to mean for us? And it's gonna show up with different definitions for each of us as well. But ultimately, the goal today is just to give everyone a starting place to see that, like, oh, my resistance is not out to get me. In fact, it is trying to tell me something important if I'm able and willing to listen to it. And there's actually a way to befriend it so that when we feel that resistance come up for us, we don't start to judge ourselves or shame ourselves for being lazy, rude, or dismissive or anything that we're used to thinking in our own mind, even if it's not being said out loud to us. So, a space to give ourselves grace. How's that sound today, Ashmi?
That sounds lovely and like what I need a little more of in my life. So I'll join for that.
Yes. And also, just a reminder as we go along, I know folks are joining. So, just hi to Jess in the comments from Miami. Thank you for joining us today. And yes, to sharing the recent comment I'm just seeing as child of immigrants, resistance shows up in many ways. That's a beautiful comment. And as two children of immigrants right here in the room, this is something we're going to bring up in our perspective again and again as well. Yeah. So let's start with what we can see. And I think oftentimes we skip over the basics, right? We get really mired up in what it means, but maybe we just slow it down and talk about what does resistance actually look like? Like, can we recognize it in ourselves? So, Ashmi, if I was to look at you and you were feeling some resistance, what would I see?
That's a great question because I would say you would see nothing because I'm really good at hiding it.
Okay.
And that's a skill that, as like living 3 decades with undiagnosed ADHD, I learned to mask just about anything. Yeah, like especially my resistance. Child of immigrants, woman of color, all the things. Like essentially where all of my identities intersect. The thing that I
Already.
learned from them was how to mask my resistance.
Mm,
So I actually think you wouldn't see very much,
mhm.
which for me, and I'm curious if this is true for you and folks listening, has been the challenge in learning how to lean into my resistance, is because I had to learn what it looked like for me in the first place
Mm,
because I got so good at hiding it from other people and myself. Like I just didn't know how to identify it as resistance.
yeah.
Um, so you would see nothing if I were to dig deeper to tell you, like, how do I know I'm feeling resistance? Like for me, it just shows up as like the inability to do something
Mm,
that
yeah. The
I,
procrastination and the resistance. Yeah.
yeah. And like, and if somebody were to ask me, like, do you want to do that thing? My answer would be yes. But it
Mm,
would be like, yes, but I can't. And generally, when I don't know why I can't get myself to do something, that's when I know it's my resistance that's showing up.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah. That's so interesting. Learning to hide it, because that's what was in the comment earlier that was shared too, right? We're so many parts of how we grow up and what we're exposed to, the communities. We just learn in this subconscious way. It's like swimming through the water and recognizing that, like, oh, if I show a part of myself, it's not accepted. And over time, if we don't check in that, like we start to just automatically respond and hide those parts of ourselves. So I chuckled a little when you said you can't see anything because of the masking. And I was like, I think that would be similar for me as well. Um, but there's a tell. there's still a tell, right? Because normally I am actually conditioned to be so agreeable. I'm like, yes, I love that idea. Yes, let's go ahead with this. That if I hesitate just a second longer before I say that yes, that's how my resistance shows up. And there's a spectrum of it now that I've like sat down and like looked at it a bit more. Similar to you, it's like, okay, I want to do something. I know I should do something, but I'm not doing it and trying to figure out why. So sometimes it's like if we're in a conversation, a person would suggest, Betty, would you like to do X? And my body is already resisting. I'll probably be like, yeah, yeah, like, so that's how it can show up. It could be very, very subtle. But on the more extreme side, like conversations with family members where the full resistance shows up as in like I'm just digging my heel in and I'm like, I'm not actually going to change my opinion about X just because of what you're saying as well. So I think it just depends on the level of, for me at least, the level of comfort I have in how much of that I can show as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what listening to you, what came up was this idea of safety um, and the concept of being allowed to show resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like for most of my life, I felt like I wasn't allowed to even show that I was feeling resistant to anything, which is why I learned how to mask.
Mm.
But yeah, like you said, I think for people I feel really safe around, they would be like, yeah, you're resistant all the time. And it's like, right, because I feel safe enough to say no. And yeah, and I think the question that a lot of us can ask ourselves is also, do I create safety within myself to
Mm-hmm.
allow myself to feel resistance towards something, and like build enough safety to investigate what that means instead of
Mm-hmm.
constantly trying to shame myself into doing it, or just being like, you just got to have grit and push through it or hustle or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
All of the keywords that we use to get ourselves through resistance by
Yeah.
pushing.
Mm-hmm. And partly it's because we're rewarded for that, right? Like
Yeah.
when you are someone who can push through, muscle through, you're seen as strong. You're seen as resilient in that case. But if you're someone who's resisting or saying no or have a different opinion or a different approach to something, the way most of us experience that is like, oh, you're not a team player or you're just not open-minded enough, etc. So there's a lot of the overall judgments that come from one side or the other of grinding as opposed to a more gentle approach is that one is better than the other. At least that's what a lot of workplaces, family contacts, and even in school when we work with teachers, we've seen that as well. Out, not to say it's intentional. A lot of times it comes out of good intentions as well. But the way it lands for us is that, oh, okay. So when I disagree, when I say I'm not really into doing this right now, I'm going to be seen as someone who's not allowed to be in this situation or to participate. That becomes hard. We start to really learn to just shy away from our own resistance in that case. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for children of immigrants, anybody who's in like the BIPOC community or just any sort of community that is marginalized, not showing resistance has been a form of protection and
Yes.
survival.
Mm-hmm.
And now that we're, especially for like first gen kids, now that we have more safety to show that resistance, it's giving yourself the time and space to figure out what you feel safe and what fits your
Mm-hmm.
style.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think that adds to the grace of just knowing why it is hard for us. It's because before, in order to survive, we couldn't show it.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a level of complexity for first gen folks too, right? Because you're code switching between the culture you came from and the culture you're growing up in as well. So there's almost like two sets of spaces you need to vet of like, how safe is it for me to show up as my full self? How safe is it for me to communicate that I'm feeling some resistance or want an alternate way to do it right now? So, and those don't always overlap. So you kind of like live by a set of two rules almost. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, let's And we're here to talk about resistance. So I'm dragging my feet a little come this question, but like Ashmi, what's the resistance that's showing up for you lately? What's an example you have?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, a big place where my resistance is showing up is around just like general business development for me.
Mm.
Um, the big one is just being more visible. I am having a lot of resistance show up in my body when I'm having to like show up and essentially be myself, but out loud.
Mm.
And um, and the inner dialogue runs the gamut. Like there's the coach side of me that's like I can like self coach myself into it, and then there's the like Ashmi side that still has a lot of resistance. That is just like no matter what you say, I'm just not gonna feel great being
Yeah.
myself out loud, right? And so I think for me, it's been a lot of listening to myself and
Mm.
being able to hear. I think my journey with resistance has had a lot to do with listening to my intuition,
Hmm.
because I've spent so many years like suppressing my intuitive. And
Mm.
I am a person who has gut feelings and I go by vibes.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that's not really rewarded. And so for me, resistance and intuition go hand in hand in this sense
Yeah.
that like generally when I have resistance, it's because I'm not honoring my intuition.
Yeah. I mean, it is our intuition telling us something, right? It's like there's
Yeah.
something here that we don't like. Not necessarily is wrong, but like we just don't like something that's showing up right now. So, would you be open if I asked you a bit more about the visibility part?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, because I'm conscious you're also visible right now. I'm gonna be like
I know.
push you back into that resistance. Um, it got me curious of like what, yeah, like what feels not okay when you're being visible.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Um, I think I think because for me, what's so important about being visible is that I show up in a way that is aligned with my values, which means
Mm,
to show up authentically and unmasked. And for so long, that wasn't. I didn't feel safe doing that, and
mhm,
I learned to just like keep my head down, blend in,
mm,
and and so now that I'm doing all of the things that I spent like 30 plus years trying not to do, there is a lot of resistance with being visible and also just like talking about things that aren't necessarily talked about in a
mhm,
widespread manner, right? Like we're normalizing things that a lot of people, if they are having conversations about, are behind closed doors because it wasn't so safe to talk about this all the time.
mhm,
Um, so yeah, and so I think all of that showing up at the same time, I think my body has no other choice but to just label it all as resistance because
mhm,
it's a lot, right? Like there's no way that like our brains and our bodies can process everything as it shows up at the same time. And so
mhm.
it's going to just package it as resistance in order to feel safe and protect ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's kinda like the umbrella that holds a lot of different feelings that are coming up underneath it, and under those feelings are it's powered by a bunch of judgments that were like the voices you said, like, there's a side of us that no matter how elevated we are, there's still gonna be part of us that's, like, gonna be worried and concerned for us about things that we're gonna do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm trying to think too, because sometimes resistance is sneaky, right? It's like it's kind of like just outside my peripheral vision. So I'm like, what am I not seeing? And oftentimes, what I appreciate about talking to you is that you help me see what's in my blind spots as well, just from hearing you share. And also, I want to extend the invitation to the folks who are with us. Like, just take a moment and like think about what is a form of resistance. Like, where is the resistance showing up? I would say it's an easier place to start and then think about what is that resistance trying to tell us. I would say lately, for me, um, this is going to come out in a very nonlinear way, and that's okay. I think for me, it's like there's something around expectation. Like what you said earlier of visibility is new to you, but being masked is something you're actually more of an expert on because you've done it for a much bigger part of your life.
Yeah.
So I notice that comes up for me whenever I'm trying something new, like doing lives,
Mm,
hosting a different kind of workshop, hosting a different conversation. So even though you and I have done lives quite a few times, but like the topic which is new to us in this context, in this particular layout. So there's something I think there's a part of my brain that's like, oh, well, Betty, this should go perfectly because you've done enough of these lives that you should know how to do it now, completely bypassing and recognizing that the topic today is different from other lives I've done, therefore is newish
yeah.
comparatively. So there's I think the expectation that it needs to go perfectly. And when the live experience just differs just a little bit, it's not to say it's not a good job, but like just changes a little bit from what my mind is imagining, then that resistance starts to show up again for me. So I guess in this case, it's telling me that I have a hope for how this will show up. But then that's when I get to choose. I'm like, okay, well, perfectionism is something I'm working really hard to let go of. So do I want to keep feeding into that? Do I want to show up in accordance to that as well? So that's
Yeah.
something that's showing up for me.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
We obviously can't take our coach hats off. Um, I'm curious for you how you work, if you're able to, and how you
Mm.
have gotten better at working through that before doing the thing rather than like analyzing it afterwards.
Can you say more?
Yeah. So like you're talking about how you're working on not letting like your perfectionism get in the way, especially when you're doing
Mhm.
something new. So is that
Mm.
something that you talk yourself through before it to be like, this is new, this is why you're feeling resistance? Or do you like push through and then learn that about yourself afterwards?
Right when you said the first choice, I was like, that's such a lovely idea. I should start doing that for myself. So if that answers your question, I think most of the time when it comes to perfectionism, I don't change my course. I'm better at noticing it. I'm better at noticing that my resistance is tied to my perfectionism when it is, but I haven't gotten to the point where I I can honor that resistance in the moment. So it is a lot of like, okay, I'm feeling resistance, but I'm going to muscle through. I'm going to do this thing anyways. And then afterwards, I'm like, oh, I could have given myself a little grace around that because this is new as well. So newness layered into newness, like the live topic is new. And now even the conversation we're having, like, yeah, I'm not going to be an expert at course correcting myself beforehand based on my resistance showing up because that still is new to me as well. Because similar to you, for a very long time, I'm someone who just learned to muscle through, to suffer through a situation. So that's a good idea, Ashmi. I would try to do that more. I think I get there faster and faster, and something that really helps is actually just having people in our lives that think about resistance in the same way. They have that same level of grace, they have the same level of curiosity of like, "Oh, hey, Betty, I noticed you're not doing the thing you say you wanna do, so can I help? Like, what's that about? Do you want to explore? You want to talk it out?" And usually I find that like just by even just a simple act of like saying what I don't want to do out loud immediately lifts some of that resistance. Like I get to be a little bratty about it. I'm like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do it this way right now. And get to say it that way. And then that finally clears up enough mental clutter and space for me to have the ability to be like, oh, well, what do I want instead? What is that about? Depending on which question I want to do.
Yeah. And just to like give some insight for those listening into like the way Betty and I coach, that is something that we do with our clients all the time
Hmm.
is give them a place to talk through their resistance and like in a safe, non-judgmental place. So you can, like I have my clients all the time. Sometimes just like, do you actually want to do that?
Mm.
And sometimes it's the first time they've said out loud, no. And then there's like space to explore why not, and if it's better for them to stop forcing themselves to do that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I do that with my coach, because coaches need coaches. And so my coaches help me work through my resistance all the time. And I do think that that's like one of the strengths of coaching, is because it's just someone who's not going to judge you. And you can just
Mm-hmm.
like brain dump everything that's getting in the way and work through that in a safe container.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do find it rare. It's a rare conversation to have, right? Because when you're at home with family, it's, all filters off. Like, why aren't you doing this thing? Why aren't you going to grad school? Why aren't you staying at your job, etc.? Like all these judgments. And again, out of good intention, they want us to feel
Yeah.
safe. They want us to make money. They want us to have success and so forth. But it lands on us as like, oh my God, I'm so busy keeping your thoughts at arm's distance. I don't have that space to hear what the heck I want out of the situation at the moment. So it is helpful to have folks, either friends, therapists, or coaches, where you just feel supported. You have someone you can walk in a conversation with, and they're not going to push any advice on you. And in fact, they can ask you the questions that we've been dying to ask ourselves, like what you said, like, do I actually want to do this? And if the answer is no, I think, okay, I'm going to take a tangent here. I think for in terms of how do I phrase this? Why is it so hard to listen to our resistance? Because it's
Mm,
clearly trying to tell us something about what we want and what we truly care about. And I think when I think of saying no, it kind of just makes me feel like I'm actually saying no forever. Like, no, I don't want to do this thing. But I feel like by doing that, I'm either going to be heard as, or I'm trying to say, like, no, I don't want to do this forever, which I think adds to my resistance sometimes. And it makes it a little hard for me to hear what it's trying to tell me originally, because it's now introducing a new resistance as well.
yeah. Yeah, that's such a great thought, because I agree. I think for me, a lot of times I feel like I'm saying no forever. I think I also put this pressure that if I'm going to say no, I have resistance to this, that I must have all of the steps after that figured out.
Oh,
Because I think for me, like as I learn about my ADHD and learn, like I have an interest based brain. So for me to say yes to anything, I have to be interested in it.
mm-hmm.
So a lot of times it's not this way. It's not no. It's I don't want to do it that way.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't figured out how I want to do it yet. And so I feel like I can't say no until I can say this like whole complete plan of like, no, I don't want to do it this way, but this is the way I do want to do it. And that's what it's going to look like. Because usually I'm only ready to be like, no, not that way. And then I usually need to like lean on somebody else to help me figure out what way I do want to do it,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is probably true for a lot of us. And I think it's uncomfortable to not have all the answers and to be able to sit
Yes.
with that.
Yeah. Again, just from it makes perfect sense from just being in a society where like we are expected to have answers. And I think something I see a lot in my clients and even in my own journey as a woman of color in corporate spaces, it's when you are going to say no, you better have that whole plan B, I's dotted, T's crossed for us to receive. And I think the struggle there is that we don't want to listen to that resistance because sometimes it means it causes more work for us in certain
Mm-hmm.
situations. So the resistance actually, I don't mean to confuse you. I'm starting to confuse myself. The resistance to the initial resistance is telling us like, hey, don't say no. Or I'll take it step by step. The first thing is like, okay, can you do this project? I might feel resistance. But I feel a second resistance to say no to that and honor that first resistance, because that would mean I have to come up with a whole other project that I need to do instead, as an example. So it can get pretty layered and pretty hard to separate out sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if there's anyone on here right now that's listening that does manage other people, or you're a leader, I think that's a great thing to keep in mind of like if you have people on your team that are showing resistance, don't just shut them down if they say no. Like try to explore that with them because they're probably not saying no forever. They're probably just saying no to the way it was presented, and I'm sure that there's like a solution that works for everybody that would create just like better team dynamics, more efficiency, all the things that everybody wants.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, I do feel like giving people space to explore is the right way to approach resistance.
Hmm. And I think over time, what that does is when we make space to just get curious about the resistance, we don't have to take its information at face value. It creates a bit of trust, right? Like if I remember times when I did work with managers and leaders who are like, oh, I genuinely mean that like if you have a question or if you're not sure about something, they are able to slow down enough and be present enough with me to help me explore that, as opposed to leaders I've worked with where it's like, yes, we welcome honest feedback all day long, but the behavior doesn't match up to that
Mm.
desire, because the moment I bring something up to express my resistance or curiosity around it, I'm told to go figure it out myself, right? Which I know a lot of us have experienced as well. And I'm someone who is an advocate of like, don't assume bad intentions. I don't mean that as a rule, but like just as an aspiration, because sometimes there's something going on in that leader's life in terms of, they're being pulled into something, they're a little short on time, their cup's not full in particular. But that's why it's all the more important for us to understand our own resistance so we can advocate for what we're actually looking for, what we need, rather than relying on other people to interpret that for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Ashmi, we're exploring how complicated resistance can be, how layered it can be, and how just like it is natural to resist resistance as well. So I'm kind of curious, like what got you to finally start listening to it?
That's a great question. Um, I think this one I would say completely the therapists and the coaches in my life,
Mm,
and like my own coach training of just, I think just my first step was learning to identify things as resistance because I was misidentifying it as so many other things.
such as?
I mean, like laziness was like a huge one, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, especially before I even knew I had ADHD, just this like
Oh,
all encompassing belief that like anything that I couldn't do was just because I was lazy and wasn't trying hard enough.
mm-hmm.
And that was generally what I would go to. It's just that, oh, like you started too late or you didn't try hard enough or just, whatever I could come up with. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think learning to dig under that surface and have some grace with myself to be like, yeah, maybe I'm not lazy, maybe it's something else. That's when I learned about resistance and how to identify it. How
Mm.
about you?
I was like, let's see. As a recovering hustler, I would say I probably didn't learn to listen to my resistance until it hurt too much to bear.
Mm,
Like it was telling me that, hey, there's something about this circumstance that like doesn't work. I don't know why it doesn't work, but it just doesn't work right now. And I would still do it. I would still do it until ultimately I was burned out. I was starting to lose my confidence in something, or just I get this like restlessness, right? Like my body gets so wind up and tight about getting the thing done, because it's like it literally is like I'm imagining my body pushing itself forward as it's pushing back at the same time, and it's that shaky tension that I start to feel in my body. So at some point, one of the sides is gonna give. And I've noticed that for me, when I'm in that state of tension for too long, even after I accomplish a thing I said I do, while resistance was showing up, I don't enjoy my achievements. Right? I'm just like,
mm,
gosh, that was so exhausting of an experience. I was so tiring. Like, I'm just let me go to bed and lie down, or like let me move on to the next thing because I don't want to stay here for a second longer. So I realized it was in a weird way that if I didn't listen to my resistance that was showing up in the moment, every time again and again I was noticing it was leading me to a place where I was left with some regret. I was just left with a feeling of like, oh, like my joy got stolen in that moment, and I was the person helping my resistance. Like, my resistance the whole time was like, there's something you don't like. There's something you don't like. So I think just being able to recognize that, like, I time and again end up in a pretty painful and uncomfortable place, more painful and uncomfortable than just actually sitting with my resistance a little longer and figuring it out. And it's something for a long time I didn't know how to do, I didn't want to do. So similar to you, asked me, like, just having therapists where I do genuinely feel safe with and having coaches I feel safe with helped me slow down enough. And I think, like with most things we experience in life, when we realize, like, oh, I can sit with this discomfort, our comfort zone for that, our tolerance for that grows as well. And the way I simply put it, someone's probably going to shake their head at me saying it's like, oh, I didn't die. I didn't die after this experience, right? And over time, I think I started to get more and more curious because, like, every time on the flip side now, every time when I did listen to my resistance, as soon as I can, um, I'm always left in a better place. I'm left in a place where I felt like even though I was doing something hard, I felt taken care of in that process as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And this brings me back to Jess's comment at the beginning of the session about feelings while finding. She said, subconsciously, that taught me not to explore those emotions and feelings while finding aspects to escape them. And like you said, like, sitting with it allows us to see it for what it is and be like, I didn't die. But we've had a lot of years of finding ways to avoid it and having like avoidance tactics. And I do think that for me, that's a way for me to backwards map myself to resistance. So like if I'm doing a lot of doom scrolling or a lot of binge watching, or like things that are my typical avoidance tactics, that will usually backwards map me to resistance. So I do think the more we learn, the better we'll get at identifying it through other things, right? Like you said, like your body just couldn't. I think like fatigue is also a great indicator, like when your body just can't anymore.
Because we all know the feeling of like when we go to sleep and we wake up rested, as opposed to going to sleep as like, I have nothing left in me to give. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a thought and I just lost it. It's gone.
Welcome to our spaces, people. We have many thoughts and they will come back to us. Yeah. I would say, again, I want to welcome folks who are coming in a little later. Hi, Shannon. Thanks for joining us. And also, just today, we're exploring resistance and how it shows up for us and how it can give us insights about what we really need. So if there's something that you're feeling resistance about and you want to explore up here, like, feel free to leave a comment in the chat and we'll pull it into our conversation today as well. Yeah, I think for me, like, I guess I'm a little curious, Ashmi, just to keep going into this. We're both a little more practiced with noticing our resistance. I would not go as far as to like call us experts in this case. And there's always moments where I'm wondering, like, oh, will there be a day where I will be able to get past feeling resistance at all? Thoughts on hearing a statement and a hope like that?
My answer is no. But that's just because I'm like such a strong believer of there's no, like, you know, when people are like, you'll reach the end of the road or this like ideal version of you or whatever. Like, I don't think that's true. I think we're always changing and evolving. And like I said, like, life is hard and I think it does continue to stay hard. And so I think we'll get better at it better honoring it, better being nice to ourselves, all those things. Um, I think just the fact that we're human beings means that it is something that we'll keep feeling in different ways. Um, yeah, I just believe that we'll get better at dealing with resistance and seeing it. I don't think there's this like ideal place that we'll reach where we just never feel it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a hot take?
We'll let the audience tell us if that's a hot take. Um, yeah, I find myself nodding along. I find myself not having any resistance to that statement because yes, it is true. I think especially if it's something like resistance at the end of the day, our society has taught us is a bad thing, but it is actually pretty neutral. Very much like our emotions, there's a mix of positive and less and like harder feelings to have to sit with as well and to recognize, but they're all just communicating something back to us about what we need for that particular moment in that particular conversation as well. So I think if we're able to, for me, I'm like, okay, well, if it's never going to be gone, how do I how do I befriend it? How do I live with it? So if it's going to be my roommate for life, like let's just learn to be together and enjoy our time together as much as we can. And at the end of the day, like we don't have to be besties, but just like how do we respect and understand what how to move around each other in this space? Yeah, what are some things that has helped you befriend your resistance?
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something you said a while ago of just realizing that I can either push through my resistance and not listen to it and just grind, and that
Mm,
it's probably going to be harder for me than giving myself space and sitting in the discomfort a little bit to honor my resistance and see what's under that. So
mhm.
I think years of not leaning into the resistance has taught me that it might be a little bit easier to sit with it. And and I'm seeing Shan's comment here, which we can um, talk about in a second. Yeah, I think for me, it's about honoring my intuition, right? And that feels better and sits better with me and the life I'm trying to design right now. So I think for me, I just like remind myself that that's the choice I ultimately want to keep making.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And for a chance question as well, like, is there a difference between resistance and intuition? I think they're connected. They're like one. I've never tried this definition on before, but I would say our intuition is our gut feeling informed by what we truly want as opposed to what we should want. And resistance is a language that that intuition uses to communicate that to us. And what Ashmi shared earlier is like resistance sometimes can be a flux of like a lot of things coming up for the same time. But what our body and our minds registered is like, okay, I'm not all in. This is not like a hell yes situation for me right now. And a way to learn from our resistance is to slow down enough to recognize like what are all those emotions underneath that that our intuition is also communicating to us. Like, why am I resisting this? What about the situation feels like it's bringing up the resistance for me? And that as well. Yeah. At this point, I forgot my question to you. I was planning to answer it, Ashmi, so apologize.
I was literally going to be like, I forgot exactly how you said it, but how about you, Betty?
Yeah. Hmm. I don't know. It's something that, like, as we said in the beginning, it's present in our weeks. So it's something that we're both still sitting with, just like what are yeah, I guess somewhere my brain is taking me now is like, okay, well, we've explored resistance, what it looks like, why it's hard to listen to, and what it could be saying to us. Like, what are say maybe like three questions we can give the folks who are listening today? Like, what are three things they can ask themselves when they notice that resistance coming up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a good one to start with is like, what is my resistance trying to communicate with me? So, like you just said, it's a language.
Hmm.
Um, so, like, what is it trying to tell me? I always like to ask myself if that's true, because sometimes my resistance is showing up through like my limiting beliefs, and so it's not always true,
Hmm.
or it's not always something that I want to choose to listen to. And then, and then once you investigate that, it's just a question of like, what do I want to do with that? So, like I said, I don't always want to listen to it, but I think giving yourself time to, even just giving yourself the choice of like, you can or cannot listen to it,
Yeah.
is, I think, a great place to learn more about it.
Hmm.
What do you think?
Hmm. I think those are three great questions. Like, what is it telling us? And sometimes I would say if that feels really hard to answer, that's usually actually a really helpful sign to not have to do it alone, right? So there's a phrase that a coach, both Ashmi and I work with, Yuri. Shout out to you, Yuri, for teaching us this phrase of if it's easy, do it yourself, but if it's hard, do it together, right? So having those trusted spaces in your friends, your therapists, and your coaches to be like, okay, I feel resistance. I know it's trying to tell me something, but I don't speak this lingo right now. Can you help me slow down enough so we could actually figure out what is my authenticity? What is my gut feeling telling me that it wants me to hear? And I think it's correct of like just vetting to see if it's true because oftentimes there's thoughts that like fly through our minds very quickly like I'm not good enough or like I can't be leader, I can't be visible. That feels like hard and fast rules. So just even naming it out loud, sometimes we take it out of our blind spot and we get to interrogate like whether or not that is true. And it may be true right now, but again, similar to the no of like when we say no, it doesn't have to be no forever. If something is true in the moment, it doesn't have to be true forever. It just depends on what you want to see in your life more. So if visibility is something that you want to achieve, then that is something you have a choice around. If your resistance is telling you, hey, I'm feeling a little scared, I'm feeling a little hesitant around being visible or asking someone out or leaving a job and so forth. So whatever is that choice, that decision you need to make in front of you, if you're not coming to a fast answer of like, absolutely, this is for me, and you feel that yourself like pulled towards it, then that's a lot of space for you to play in terms of getting curious of like, all right, this is a form of resistance, but what type is this for me today?
Yeah, and I think that also when we're new to this, it's not so like I think when we talk about listening to your intuition, it sounds really easy, like it's supposed to be really loud and just tell you definitively what you're gonna do and how to do it. And I don't think that's necessarily true for a lot of folks. And making that okay for yourself that like sometimes you won't know what you want to do. And that's fine. And I think it's giving yourself permission to try different things and learn from
Hmm.
just like trial and error, data collection. Sometimes with my clients, I'll just give them homework and call it a research project to be like, we're just going to try something this week and you're just going to come back and report how it went. No pressure on it being perfect or anything, but like
Hmm.
sometimes you just have to try a bunch of things to realize what works for you. And it's not
Hmm.
always this obvious, I know exactly what I want to do. A lot of times it's, I know I don't want to do that, but I have no idea what I do want
Yeah.
to do. And that's also okay. And in my opinion, really normal.
Yes. Yeah. That shows up in a lot of authenticity work as well. It's just like, how do we listen to the no's as much as we listen to the yeses, the things that we do want? Because sometimes it is hard to articulate what we truly want, because it feels very vulnerable to put that out there, and it shows up in our life as like we don't want whatever the opposite of that is. So just being able to recognize the opposite of what your yes and no is telling you is also something helpful if like looking into what your needs are, what boundaries are important to you, what are your values. Like those are some things that your resistance can actually give you more insight into as well over time. And I think Ashwin, something you said just made me think of like, yeah, I feel like if we all had a map or a rule book of like what what life is going to look like for Ashmi, what life is going to look like for Betty. Like, we'll already know. We'll have that book and
Mm.
we'll just follow step by step, and there's no resistance to be had. But because none of us have, we're not born out of the womb with a book of like, oh, here are the things that you're meant to do for your whole life. A lot of moving through our weeks, our days, our relationships, our goals is actually one big experiment as well, and we need those data points to help us figure out what is that outcome we ultimately want to create for ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're anything like me, when I learn something new, I then all of a sudden feel like I have to do it all at the same time. So
I know that
we're
feeling.
just yeah, right. So I'm just like, oh, like I'm learning about resistance. So every time I'm feeling resistant, I have to like dig into it and find out what's happening and make a decision. Um, yeah, it's okay to not do that, and it's okay to just like pick one thing that you want to focus on and let the other resistance just exist for a little while.
Mhm.
And something I'm trying to repeatedly tell myself is like, it doesn't always have to be that deep.
Mhm.
Sometimes, generally, it is, but like if you just don't have the energy for it, and your body is telling you not now, then um, I think that we can honor that as well and not make ourselves like drink from the fire hose of resistance and figure all of it out at the same time.
Yes, yes. How do we put it? It's an acquired taste. Yeah, so I mean, we're almost at the top of the hour. Um, I guess I just want to start closing us out and say like we really appreciate the folks who were able to make it here today. um, it's not a topic that we see a lot of conversation space for, because most of us are just expected to walk right past or right over our resistance, or to place judgment on other people we see showing up for resistance as well, and that includes ourselves sometimes. So we just hope today's conversation gave you a few thought starters and a few places to look when you're ready to look. As Ashmi said, you don't have to go right up to the waterfall and have that everything just come down on you. And if you feel like you want to explore this more deeply, then please, by all means, feel free to reach out to one of us. We'd love to talk. And for us, it's really important to not turn resistance into an enemy, and to actually normalize that it is okay to feel resistance and to give ourselves a grace. And I believe with that grace and with that space we give ourselves, we start to learn a lot more about who we are, and we get better advocating for what we actually need.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And if folks are still on and you feel safe enough and want a little bit of accountability, feel free to leave something in the chat about just how you're going to either honor or investigate your resistance. We'd
Mm.
love to hear um, how folks are going to do that for themselves. And yeah, if you don't want to put in the comments and you want to send us a DM, just if that feels safer, we'd love to hear from you there as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, excited to hear about how this has resonated for folks.
Yeah. And we'll leave a comment after today's event, for those who can't catch the whole thing. Well, actually, you might be gone already, but for those who are staying and want to come back and just hear a point that we talked about, this will be available for replay as well. So we can share the links to our website in a comment. So in case you wanted to reach out, you can find us there as well.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Well,
thanks so much for coming today.
yes. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you guys soon. Bye.